So, welcome to the Punishment and Society Digital Speaker Series. Punishment and Society is a collaborative research network, or CRN, of the Law and Society Association. Today, we hear from Renan Araújo, sorry, I practiced that and I fucked it up, who is an associate researcher at Rethink Priorities. He holds an MSc in Criminal Justice Policy from the LSE and a law degree from the Federal University of Pernambuco, Brazil. And he will be discussing the Latin American left turn and the Neoliberal Penality hypothesis, a case study of Pernambuco, Brazil. With that, I turn it over to you, Renan.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today. Bear with me as I share my screen. Let me see if that works smoothly. Is it looking good? Fantastic. All right. So I'm going to present on my master's dissertation theme. There are some things that I changed since, but not much. And so some of the people in the audience, such as Johan, are somewhat familiar with this, or very familiar with this. So yeah, and I plan to have some just present for around 20 minutes, and then we can have a discussion and you can ask questions. And I look forward to hearing your feedback. So the theme is the Latin American left turn and the neoliberal penalty hypothesis. And I approached this with a case study of Pernambuco, which is the state in Brazil where I was born and raised and where I currently live. Let me just start with the bottom line so you can have this in mind throughout the presentation. What I tried to do with this research project was have a look at the neoliberal penalty hypothesis first described by Wacquant. And he argues that austerity leads to punitiveness as a form of social control. And my core argument was that upon checking the evidence regarding Pernambuco in that period of the 2000s and 2010s, it didn't seem to accurately explain the rise in punitiveness in that region. I used government data and interviews with key decision makers that participated in designing the security policy of the state during that time. And I concluded that the rise in punitiveness was mostly based on a local left-wing perception that increasing state capacity across all fields of public policy, education, health, and criminal justice, including public security, is better for the poor. And this view seems to resemble a broader punitive rise in Brazil and Latin America during the left turn. So there seems to be some resemblances between a broader movement. And this broader movement is distinct from what is usually referred to as the neoliberal penalty in global northern countries. So this is the core of my argument in that research. Right, so I'm gonna take you through 4 parts. 3 of them are substantive, and the last one is just to wrap up. But let me start with some context and outlining the problem that I tried to tackle with this research. So brief explainer of Wacquant's neoliberal penalty hypothesis is that as the state, usually neoliberal states, decrease welfare policies and decrease the standard of living of the poor, they simultaneously increase punitive measures, and as a consequence, we can see rises in the prison population, in police surveillance, and other forms of surveillance. And this is a way of controlling the poor, or like the people who are in dire straits, low income classes. And this is a mechanism of control. And so this is the thing that I'm trying to analyze if it was applied to the Latin American left turn. And this moment in Latin American history is also known as the pink tide. And it's defined as the rise of left-wing governments that replaced austerity policies from previously neoliberal administrations with more robust state intervention. And in the photo, you can see Nestor Kirchner, Evo Morales, Lula, and Hugo Chavez from the left to the right. And this was a pretty overarching change that happened in the continent. So the first noticeable change was in Venezuela with the election of Mr. Chavez. Then we saw it in Chile, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Bolivia, Ecuador, and arguably other countries. So this is a pretty defining moment of Latin American political economy and history. And what does it say about the penalty, about the punitiveness, and how this political economic movement approached punishment? It seems that there is a distinction in comparison with what Wacquant found. Wacquant argues that he found the neoliberal penalty also in countries such as Brazil, but some other researchers seem to argue that at the same time that there was an increase in welfare policies and in the standard of living of the poor, there was an increase as well in punitive measures in the prison population and prison rates and police surveillance. So this was funded, financed by the 2000s commodity boom. And these governments, in an oversimplification, but that's to some extent a shared characteristic, they increased public spending across the board. And crime control wasn't some border case or an ignored part of that policy. For many of these governments, crime control was pretty crucial, pretty central, and fueled the political discourse of many of these new Latin American leaders and their populist rhetoric. So I take this broader context and look at it from the perspective of what happened in Pernambuco, Brazil. Just a little bit more of information and context. Pernambuco is a state in northeastern Brazil. You can see it in the map. And the Northeast is one of the poorest and most violent regions of the country. During the end of the 2000s and beginning of the 2010s, not only the federal government in Brazil changed with the election of Lula, which is from the Workers' Party, in Portuguese called PT, you can see in the image, but there were also state leaders, governors that were elected and followed this same political economic perspective. Pernambuco was one of the major ones. So the Brazilian Socialist Party had a nationwide partnership with the Workers' Party. And you can read in the image that essa aliança tem história. This means this alliance has history. And below, this alliance has a future. So it was a really close partnership between the two parties. And since its election, since its rise to power in 2007, the Brazilian Socialist Party has stayed in power ever since. It's been a while, even after the Workers' Party in Brazil left power. But I'm not going to analyze the entirety of this period. I'm going to focus on the beginning of this period when these two parties and this left-wing alliance was the most powerful political coalition in Brazil and in that region. So as a powerful political coalition, the Brazilian Socialist Party implemented many managerial reforms and boosted public spending across the board in Pernambuco. Remember, there was a lot of funding stemming from the commodities boom, and the state governors were also benefiting from that. So you can see in this table, which isn't the prettiest thing, I apologize for that, but hopefully it's understandable. But you can see that in absolute numbers, the government expenditure rose substantially, more than doubled in the period between 2008 and 2014 in Pernambuco. And this absolute change was reflected across the board in many different types of social policies from health. This is the budget of the health department. You can also see the budget of the education department and the social defense department, which is in charge of the police in the region. So even if you look at the percentages, while the absolute numbers change, the percentages, some of them do not change that much, but it is enough to assess and see clearly that health and education did not see a decrease in their spending. At the very least, they stayed relatively the same share of the total budget. And while criminal justice, social defense in this table raised substantially, or not even that substantially actually, but. And regarding crime rates, and with the usual caveat that you can't assess through homicide rates the reality of the violence or crime in a given region, but this is just a simplification for context. Pernambuco, which is the orange line, was historically, and this is a plot of the most populous states in Brazil. And historically, Pernambuco was at the very least in the top three states with the highest homicide rate. And in the section that is highlighted in red, this is the period in which the Brazilian Socialist Party had its first mandate. And although it is pretty clear that there is a downward trend that started before, that downward trend seemed to increasing pace and go down much more quickly during that period. And this led the Brazilian Socialist Party to claim that their investment in public security was a success. After all, this is a clear indicator that, at least for public polls and electoral purposes, that violence is decreasing. But there are also some not very good, but some data on perceptions of the fear of crime, perceptions of security. They're not very good, but it is not controversial that during that period, crime decreased. What is controversial is the cause of it. And of course, that the management will argue that their policies were the cause of it. So going ahead, what I asked myself is if this penalty, if this increase in punitiveness and that came associated with a decrease in crime, but could have not been associated with that. But I wanted to make sense of if there was something distinct about this penalty, that something that maybe could be referred to as Southern or Brazilian, or even restricted to the Pernambuco context, if there was something different with it. So in more detail, I asked myself, is Pernambuco different from the neoliberal penalty description of how punitiveness typically rose in the 90s and 2000s? So that, and by typical description, I refer to Wacquant's hypothesis. And if it was different, how different it was, and why was it different? So the goals of this project were, first and foremost, humbly add another data point of Southern penalty to the literature. Second, test the generalizability of this popular hypothesis, and if it was suitable to explain the rising punitiveness everywhere, specifically in this case. And to better understand what happened locally, try to make sense of what was similar, what was different in comparison with broader trends. And besides looking at these public data on public spending and crime rates and prison rates, I also did, and I inadvertently omitted the amount of interviews here. Sorry, I did 12 interviews with key decision makers that led Pernambuco's security policy during that period. I interviewed former military police chiefs, some secretaries of state secretaries, and city level secretaries of public security, and some other people involved in higher middle management. So I had a bunch of questions that I wanted to ask them. And I started with checking if the punitiveness, the coherent package of public security policies that took place during that time. I started asking if this was imported from somewhere else, because, sorry about that, because I knew from public records that a lot of high-ranking police officers had visited several American police departments in the late 90s. So they went to New York, Miami, Washington, D.C., and I initially assumed that there was going to be some clear influence on their way of thinking about public security. So I asked them, and I pasted here some representative quotations. So one of them said that they went there in 95, well before the pact, and implying that it had nothing to do with how they came up with the pact. And by pact, I refer to Pact for Life, which is the name of that comprehensive set of public security policies. And another quotation is, I think the most valuable experience we can look at is the one in Colombia. So I asked them about the US. And they say, because when you compare experiences with the United States, for example, it's very lame in their opinion, because the reality is so different from ours. But not Colombia, for it's a country in South America, poor like ours, that faced greater violence than ours and managed to reduce it. So this former military police chief was one of the people that was telling me that Bogota and Medellin in Colombia were their major inspirations for this policy, or at least one of their inspirations, but not the US. And there is one of the secretaries that I interviewed who traveled to Bogota, I believe, over 15 times in the last 10 years. And he has some really close connections with Bogota's policymakers, but none apparently, or at least they explicitly denied connections with the US. So my interviewees dismissed the US as a valid inspiration for their security program, which is part of the neoliberal penalty rationale that some southern countries are importing this punitive rationality to their countries. Another question that I posed, or set of questions, was regarding ideology. So I was curious that a left-wing coalition was advancing very punitive, repressive policies. And I wanted to know if the policymakers had a punitive ideology, which is currently, at least in Brazil and in other places where the far-right populism rose, that kind of punitive discourse is the mainstream nowadays. So I was curious to know if this was an ideological seed within left-wing policymakers or something like that. So I asked them about how they conceived of the security program, how they developed it. And one of the military police chiefs mentioned that it is necessary to think about security policy as prevention and repression. The work of the police alone was not enough. There had to be more actions of public authorities in cities. Violent communities are also the most abused ones. There are no schools, no basic sanitation, basic rights are not provided. You need social policies backing it up. So this reasoning was the most common one by far. So even this particular former police chief who told me that he voted in Bolsonaro and had some punitive views developed recently, he was clear that in the development of the security program, Pact for Life, it was absolutely necessary to have both repressive and preventive policies. And let me go back a couple of many slides. So in this graph, you can see that after the period that I highlighted, there is this huge surge, this spike in the homicide rate. And many of these policymakers that refer to Pact for Life as a combination of repressive and preventive measures, many of them argued that this failure was a product of the lack of preventive measures and robust social policies. So ideologically, they seem to be in tune with what I expected from a left-wing progressive discourse, and that did not emphasize repression as the way to go to reduce crime. So this is a table in which you can see the disparity between discourse and practice. So, I mean, not that clearly, maybe I'm overclaiming here, but what I want to say is that it is clear that they indeed focused on the repression part of this idea. And you can see that the number of prisoners rose, the incarceration rate rose, prison capacity and prisoners and incarceration rate rose, but they also invested relatively little, but somewhat invested in prison capacity. And yeah, so the repressive side of the policy was really clear, but the preventive side of the policy was not. And this is described by these interviewees and the literature as one of the reasons for the failure of the program. So I wanted to find reasons for that. And some of the tentative reasons that I found in the discourse of these decision makers was that criminal justice is one of the most tangible policy realms, kinds of policy, for populist leaders across the political spectrum, not only on the right, but also on the left. And this was definitely the case in Pernambuco. And especially in a place where violence is rampant, such as northeastern Brazil and Pernambuco, repression can lead to short-term results that suit electoral cycles and electoral desires. So it is a kind of policy that is perfect for the short-term results and political purposes as the political system is. And prevention, on the other hand, is much harder and less tractable, which is a lot of this is obvious, but it was interesting to see in their discourse this kind of clarity. But prevention is much harder and less tractable. You don't have the homicide rate changing if you pull some strings in the short term. So even when there is the desire to implement it, it can be challenging to do so. Right. And lastly, what I wanted to assess is if what happened in Pernambuco was similar to any other region. And this is also very tentative. I did not go about actually doing many case studies or a comparison of case studies or something. But my impression is that these findings seem to be in tune with what Máximo Sousa found in Argentina during Kirchnerism and what Manuel Iturralde found more broadly during the Latin American left term. Carrington and colleagues also mentioned similar findings when they argue in their classical paper for a Southern criminology. So there are some ongoing research projects, maybe any one of them has been completed and I'm not aware of that, but they are now looking at the Brazilian penalty under the Workers' Party, and they seem to point in a similar direction. So I'm not super up to date with them, but if anyone is interested in that, I can look harder for these references and share them with you. And just wanted to say that I see most of my contribution as an extra data point, another data point, and that as always, more research contributing with other data points about the southern hemisphere is desirable, so you can have a better sense of what's going on. So the bottom line is just to reiterate, I think that the neoliberal penalty hypothesis first described by Wacquant and also replicated by many Brazilian and Latin American scholars doesn't seem to explain the rise in punitiveness in Pernambuco. And I think that the explanation lies mostly on local political process and a leftist perception that increasing state capacity across all fields is better for the disadvantaged, which seems to resemble some of the political economic movement of Brazil, Latin America more generally. And a considerable part of the literature, at least the Brazilian literature that I'm aware of, needs to some updates to factor that in more explicitly. So yeah, thank you very much. I can send these slides for you if you want. There are references, and feel free to contact me. I have some discussion prompts, and yeah, thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So if everyone can join me in a virtual round of applause. So I don't know if you can see us clapping, but thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
So we now have time for a Q&A. So as a reminder, we are recording this talk. So if you would like to ask a question, but without being on camera, if you would like to put your question in the chat, then I can read your question for you so you don't have to be recorded. Otherwise, please feel free to raise your virtual hand under reactions. And I see we already have questions, so I'll turn it over to Michael.
Awesome, thank you, Renan. That was super informative and interesting. I have a just sort of general question about your take, now that you've done this research, your take on the neoliberal penalty thesis. And it's really, I'm curious if you think that your findings and some of the other studies also in Latin America that you referenced, do you think that the takeaway ought to be that the neoliberal penalty thesis can be refined and improved through your findings and interpretation? Or do you think that it should be replaced with something entirely different? Not that you necessarily may or may not know what that is yet, but should we scrap it, or should we tinker with it and figure out why it doesn't apply and what that can, how that can improve it? Or yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's definitely something that I kept in mind. So I think that so I kept that in mind throughout this project, but I think that my research isn't enough to say that like there is much more research out there that provides some kind of support to it. But I think that my takeaway would be that while the neoliberal penalty thesis can be completely applicable to some countries and in the global north and some specific contexts, maybe that's not the case for all of the countries in the world, and probably not the case for Pernambuco specifically, possibly Brazil. But yeah, I'm not. I wouldn't bet 100% of my money on that. I look forward to seeing further research.
Great, thank you. Johan? Oh, sorry.
Hi, Renan. I hope this question is going to make sense. I hope I can pierce the fog of my own malady to be able to pose a question clearly here. Something that was in the back of my mind for much of your talk and then came to the front of my mind when you delivered your takeaways was a question about the extent to which, excuse me, the extent to which crime and justice governance in Brazil is administered at the level of the state, as opposed to at federal level, as opposed to something more local. That was traveling in the back of my mind up until the moment when you delivered as a takeaway the need to inject, excuse me, inject nuance into what is being understood as a Southern penalty thesis, a self-consciously regional claim. And I'm trying to kind of map some unanswered question in my mind about the level of governance at which penology works. Is it at the level of Pernambuco? Is it at the level of Brazil? Onto a set of questions about the regional or local scale at which you think we should be thinking about quote unquote Southern criminology. In that fog, did a question come through?
I think so, yeah, and
Okay,
it makes a lot of sense for me, I think. Let me try to paraphrase it, just to make sure that I got it correctly. So at the same time that I'm arguing that we need to inject nuance and local context to understand penalty and punitiveness, I'm also arguing that my local study is like generalizable to Brazil or to Latin America, and where, like, I mean, just an oversimplification. I'm not arguing that, but saying that we can learn some things about a broader context that is beyond the state level. So I think that this tension isn't resolved with this research project, which may be obvious, but I guess that there is definitely a huge component of state level governance of criminal justice in Brazil. So police departments are state level, but at the same time, a lot of the budget of these police departments come from the federal government. And in some particular moments in Brazilian history, the partnership between federal and state level governance was increased or much stronger than in other moments. So for instance, I think that currently with Bolsonaro, there is some sort of disconnect. So while some states are in tune with Bolsonaro's far-right approach to repressive criminal justice and like very punitive approach, other states are not. So this is not very synced up. And in the historic period that I analyzed the Latin American left turn, I think that this was much more in sync, especially for Pernambuco. So that's why I think there is something to learn from the Pernambuco experience that is transferable to Brazil and possibly to Latin America because of these similarities. But yeah, it's definitely not everything. Did I answer it? Hopefully it made sense.
You kind of did, and I'm grateful to the answer. If I can just leave you with a reflection, not a question per se, more just a provocation, one that you might just let sit for a little bit, is as you work on preparing this for submission, is that I'm sorry, I'm really sorry, but is that when I read theories of neoliberalism itself, I see something of a split in the different traditions of theorizing neoliberalism's scope, both the scope of its globalization and the scope of at what level does it work, hence what motivated the question of at what level of governance is crime and justice administered in Brazil. And so when I kind of plot people like David Harvey up against people like Wendy Brown, who are theorizing neoliberalism as happening at very different kind of levels of scope and in a lot of different ways. There's an open and unanswered question about whether the phenomenon, the site that you have selected for this study even plausibly counts as one that is, quote, neoliberalizing or has neoliberalized. That's an open empirical question, one that I think, I left my copy of Wacquant in my other jacket pocket, but I think Bernard Harcourt would go so far as to say that what you've observed in Pernambuco doesn't even count as neoliberal, because what counts as neoliberal is itself hardly even neoliberal. That's the kind of Harcourt thesis. And I would invite you to consider, what is it about this site that you think makes it an appealing site to observe something about neoliberalism itself? And to answer that question requires an answer to the question I originally posed about, well, where does penality happen in Brazil? Okay, that's the provocation. Please don't treat that as a question, because like the first intervention, it was also gibberish, but thanks anyway. And before I close, I just want to thank you for it takes a lot, having just finished your master's, to share your work with people, and so you deserve a round of applause, and also Ashley deserves a round of applause for hosting that. Thank you very much to both of you.
Thanks, Johan. So I'm going to go ahead and use my organizer's prerogative to get in the queue, but again, please feel free to raise your digital hand or write your question in the chat, and I'm happy to read it for you. So I have two thoughts, one of which is kind of a comment that was kind of formulated in my mind as you were talking. And I was kind of envisioning, basically, if you think about the overall literature on like punitiveness and governance and stuff as like this 2x2 table, where you have like I guess the variables of the 2x2 table are different instantiations of big government, one of which is social prevention, and the other one is punitiveness. And so like, you know, the positive social prevention, like lots of big government policies with education and stuff, and then kind of low on punitiveness is like mid-century penal welfareism, like that whole thing. And then like in the 1990s, we get like low on social prevention in the global north, and like big on punitiveness and stuff. And so it's kind of interesting to think about this basically as this 2x2 table, and like what's getting filled in. And so you're kind of doing the one where it's you know, big on social prevention, but also big on punitiveness. And so it's like a third instantiation of this like 2x2 table. I don't know if we have any examples of negative on social prevention and negative on prevention, negative on punitiveness, but it's kind of interesting to think about it that way, of like mapping the literature in that 2x2 table. And so kind of the takeaway from that is part of what you're doing is kind of reminding us that there are not only temporal scope conditions on any given penalty thesis, be it neoliberalism or penal welfareism, but also regional scope conditions. And this might get back to part of what Johan's question is. This is what Southern criminology is telling us is, you know, there are also regional scope conditions on the claims that we're making. It's not just the world experiences neoliberalism, so we have these, you know, these shifts, but also they're experienced in different ways and in different places, even within the same era. So that was the first thing that I was just kicking around, for whatever that's worth. You can feel free to not respond, because it's just a thought. My actual question. Oh yeah, sorry, go for it.
Oh, sorry. Maybe I can respond to that, just to make sure that I don't miss anything. Yeah, I think that your description was pretty accurate of what is on my mind after this project. So I think of this 2x2 table, or like n by n table, as something that has all sorts of possible combinations. So perhaps even putting health and education in the same bucket, maybe limiting to some context. So the challenge is always, how much can we simplify to make sense of a general trend, and how much we have to go local. So with this project, I think that what I'm arguing is that we should like push the needle towards the local more than what is usually argued. But touching on what Johan mentioned, because I think that it relates to that, but it's definitely tricky to make sense of all of the definitions of neoliberalism that are around there. So, and this is something that I really wanted to do, I think, but at this point, I tried my best to define neoliberalism as something that a specific author or body of literature referred to. And when I found out that Wacquant had like a couple of papers on Brazil, and he did this like ethnography or something like that, like field work on Rio. And then in the paper, he argued that this like could be transferable to other parts of Brazil as well. And I think that this was around 2008 or something. So then I was more confident than before that it made sense to employ his definition. But yeah, it's that there are all sorts of definitions that put the needle in different places in that spectrum, I think, of something that is very broad and global, or something that is more local and probably different kinds of neoliberalism and so on. Yeah, so that's my comment.
Thanks, awesome. So my actual question is, I was wondering if you could say more about what punitiveness looks like in Pernambuco. And I've specifically, so you showed us the incarceration rate increasing by something like, it was like 30 or 50 or 60%, I think, from the beginning to the end. But I'm also wondering, what does incarceration look like? So it also showed us that it's like massively overcrowded. Is rehabilitation a consideration? So to kind of put my cards on the table of why I'm asking for more information about punitiveness is kind of thinking about, you know, in a sense, like mid-century US, the height of penal welfareism could also be seen as punitiveness, because we kind of, at various times when we've had like rehabilitative pushes, we want to incarcerate more people because we want to, you know, fix them with rehabilitation. And so kind of incarcerating more people is not necessarily consistent with punitiveness if we have that kind of like happy intention, essentially, even if the reality is different, kind of putting that aside. And so I could imagine where you might have a big push to incarcerate people, but the idea is we're going to fix people with institutions. Or is it like, no, it's really punitive. We're going to incarcerate people and we're going to like let them rot and like let them suffer. And it's all about deterrence and incapacitation. So that's why I'm asking. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. My view is that the incarceration strategy was, if not completely, but like the vast majority of it was pretty much punitive. So if I can share my screen, let me see if I can refer to that part again. Here you go. So you can see that there is some increase in prison capacity, and like the increase in prisoners per vacancy isn't as substantial as the increase in the prison population, but it's still that conditions are very, very harsh. And yeah, your description of people mostly being left to rot, unfortunately, it's incredibly sadly is pretty much accurate. So I think that the perception is, my view of how the decision makers made these policy decisions is that putting people in prison is relatively straightforward and can lead to electoral claims more straightforwardly. But trying to solve the historic issue of how Brazilian prisons are underfunded, do not have like basic human rights, respect for human rights in terms of structure or personnel, that's much tougher and potentially controversial as well. So yeah, to answer your question, I think that's the majority of the punitive part of the policy is putting people in prison and like over surveilling communities with the police or CCTV and things like that. And the other part, and then getting like prisons better and other like more welfarist, I guess. I mean, in comparison, approaches are perceived as the rehabilitation side, of course, but this was like left aside.
Awesome, thank you. As you were speaking, it occurred to me that it seems like one sort of parallel. It's different, but it's kind of similar in that, like, I'm trying to think of like what the term would be. It's like iron fist in a velvet glove or something like that, but that's probably not it. But I'm thinking of like the work in Scandinavia, where it's like we have on the one hand the myth of Scandinavian exceptionalism, and it's like their prisons are so nice and lovely and all this stuff, which we know is like, you know, overseeing things. But then on the flip side, their like immigration detention system is like pretty terrible, and there's kind of this like, it's welfarism for essentially white people who look like traditional Scandinavian people. But if you don't look like a traditional Scandinavian person, then you aren't the recipient of those wonderful goodies that you get through welfare. And so you get that kind of like twin of, on the one hand, welfarism and also a lot of punitivism, but it's heavily racialized. And I don't know if that's at all going on too, where it sounds like from the quotes, it's like, it's neutral. It's just, you know, if there's crime, we're going to prevent it, or we're going to try to prevent it, but we're also going to punish it. But it would be interesting if there's like at all a racialized aspect to things at all, or not. Thanks.
Yes, definitely. So I think that the funnel is, if you think of the criminal justice system as like a production line or something like that, then the racial selection is before in comparison with the Scandinavian system. So the people who go to prison are in their majority Black or brown, and there is definitely this racial component. And while they're in prison, everyone who's in prison have the same absurd conditions. But to get there, and that's the like selection part. You definitely go through this racial selection funnel, but it's in a different part of the criminal justice production line, like the police or the justice system, and so on.
Thank you. Other questions? In that case, we might go ahead and wrap it up. So if everyone can join me in a final round of applause, thanking Renan for his wonderful talk.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Ashley, for allowing me to speak in this space. And anyone feel free to contact me. I look forward to discussing this and other things more.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and see you next time.